In a terrible few seconds, a symbol of American power was blown into oblivion in what was called a terror attack. An enraged United States vowed revenge and fought a war that gained an empire and changed the world. But did we go to war for the right reasons? 3 miles off the Cuban coast, 3,000 feet down, the remains of a ship can be found. There are many sunken wrecks that are more dramatic, but few have impacted history in such a profound way. 3,000 miles from this inaccessible wreck, a more durable monument stands at our nation's most consecrated ground. On March 25, 1898, an official report concluded that the death of these 266 sailors had been the result of a terrorist attack. America demanded revenge, and Congress declared war. With the rallying cry, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," America went to war. Within 6 months, Spain was beaten, her empire in ruins. As part of the spoils of war, America moved into the Philippines, and our uneasy relationship with Cuba began. This easy conquest of Spain in 1898 would have dramatic consequences for America's. The story begins in 1880, as Congress allocates funds to build up an all-steel Navy that would protect our trading interests around the world. One of the first ships built in the Brooklyn Naval Yard was the 319-foot USS Maine. As a state-of-the-art battleship, she boasted 10-inch guns, electric lights, and was powered by 896 tons of coal. At a cost of $2.5 million, the Navy now had a powerful tool to enforce foreign policy around the globe. America's first rival was the Spanish Empire, which still controlled Cuba, and in the Pacific, the Philippines. In January of 1898, in response to bloody riots in Havana, President McKinley ordered the USS Maine to visit Cuba. Later, on February 15th at 9:40 p.m., the USS Maine erupted in a gigantic fireball, echoing throughout the city. 266 men were killed, many burned to death. Within hours, Captain Sigsbee sent an urgent message to Washington. Maine, blown up in Havana Harbor. Public opinion should be suspended until further report. The U.S. Navy quickly put together a court of inquiry to investigate the disaster. 4 naval officers, none of them with technical expertise, headed by Captain William Sampson, undertook the investigation.
The Sampson Board in 1898 was faced with the wreck of the ship, a foreign nation, and the board was conducting its inquiry while afloat on a small ship tied up next to the wreck.
Sailors from other ships were drafted to be hard hat divers. With little knowledge of ship architecture, these men tried to make sense of the underwater wreckage.
Their visibility for the divers was about 12 to 18 inches. They walked through what they called was mud, but was probably sewage from the city of Havana.
3 weeks into the investigation, divers reported a large flap of metal pushed into the inside of the ship, painted green. A check of maintenance records helped them to understand the green paint. While the Court of Inquiry considered how the bottom hull might have come to rest inside the ship, the press, hearing snippets of these details, jumped to obvious conclusions. The only thing that could have pushed these huge sheets of metal inside a hole was an explosion from the outside of the ship, a Spanish mine. That call became a demand after the Sampson Board issued its conclusions. The Maine had been destroyed by an exterior mine. War came immediately. But what really happened on the night of February 15th, 1898? By bringing the technology of the 21st century back to 1898, we can finally answer the question, what destroyed the Maine? Was it a deliberate attack or a tragic accident? America once vowed to remember the Maine. In order to solve this mystery, we must first recreate her. Fortunately, this is not as difficult as it might sound. In Philadelphia, there is anchored in the Delaware River a ship very similar to the Maine, miraculously preserved for more than a century. Our investigation begins here, and history will never be the same. Ironically, at the same time the coal was being attacked in Yemen, divers in the Caribbean were combing the waterlogged wreckage of the USS Maine. They searched for clues that would solve the mystery of what blew up the ship. The century-old debate still raged between two possibilities: an exterior mine or a tragic accident. Unfortunately, the investigation ended as researchers realized that a crucial piece of evidence, the entire front section of the ship, had been destroyed by the Navy in a second investigation 13 years after the explosion. When the Spanish-American War faded from the headlines, the remains of the USS Maine were still on prominent display in Havana.
The Cubans wanted it removed because it was blocking navigation within the harbor itself.
There were 70 bodies that were still unaccounted for, including 2 officers. One of the main reasons for dewatering the ship was to look for human remains and to reunite the 70 bodies with their compatriots who had already been buried in Key West of the United States.
13 years after the disaster, in 1911, Congress allocated money, and the Army Corps of Engineers accepted the challenge. They would build a cofferdam surrounding the wreckage of the USS Maine and pump the water out. A project of this size had never been attempted before.
The construction of the cofferdam took well over a year before they were even beginning to pump the water out, and that's when the problems started manifesting themselves, when you expected it to be watertight and it wasn't, and then the tide came in, and then they got hit by a couple of hurricanes.
Eventually, the engineers were successful, and sections of the Maine began to emerge. As the work progressed, 52 bodies were recovered from the ship, along with many personal items. Remembering was only part of the plan. The Navy wanted to verify and lay to rest questions about the sinking.
William B. Ferguson was a young naval constructor that was assigned by the Navy to help the Army identify parts of the ship.
Hoping to make sense out of the chaos being exposed, Ferguson painted lines showing the tortured keel and some supporting bulkheads. He also drew diagrams to clarify the specifics of the debris field. Ferguson's search to find the large chunk of hull bent inward, reported by the divers in 1898, paid off in November of 1911. This large flap of steel had once been part of the outer hull. These pictures show clearly that it has somehow been folded over to be inside the ship, thus corroborating for the board in 1898 evidence of an exterior mine. After studying Section 1 in detail and verifying several theories, our investigation is complete. We are now ready to recreate the events of February 15th, 1898. All that day, a smoldering coal fire heated the bulkhead in the 6-inch reserve magazine. At 9:40 p.m., 6 tons of gunpowder exploded in the magazine. Nanoseconds later, 2 other magazines erupted, blowing out the sides of the ship and sinking her. As water rushed into the ship, it carried with it the large flap of metal, now known as Section 1. Although the subsequent war with Spain was justified as an appropriate response to a terrorist act, what happened to the Maine was more an act of God than a deliberate act of man.
One has to ask themselves, why is it important to know the truth of the loss of the Maine? Well, the answer's right behind me. We would do them a great disservice if we explained it away as a Spanish mine exploding it, rather than what really happened to them. These men died in service to their country, and to distort how they died is dishonor.
History once made cannot be undone, and today's news will be tomorrow's history. If the loss of the Maine and the men who walked her decks can have any more meaning, then perhaps it might be to make sure that those words are never forgotten. We must understand the past in order not to relive it. Those words have never been invested with more meaning than they are today.